So I'm going to just welcome us to our session for co-teaching. And we're going to talk about co-teaching and instructional strategies. And we're doing this session for principals as part of a 4-part series that we're going to do just to add some information and provide you with some extra support in some of the areas that we talk a lot about in special education, but we've not all had a lot of time to spend in coursework or pre-service programs have not always given us all this information in terms of special education. So that's the intent of our network. So those 4 meetings. However, at any time, if you all want to suggest a topic, this month's topic is co-teaching, and then there's another one in November, and it will be behavior and discipline. And Teresa Combs will be our presenter for that one. We have 2 more sessions in the spring, but we are always open for sessions that would help you in the area of special education as you lead your building and your departments at your own schools. So we just want to make sure you have all the resources and tools necessary to help you with your job. So let's take just a moment to look at the questions. And these are just some questions for reflecting. And here's one that we think about. How do we distinguish between accommodations, modifications, and instructional strategies? So that's one thinking point about this work. Because we were able to do a survey with some new special education teachers in the fall. And what we found was even special education teachers, not just special ed teachers and regular ed teachers, but they are having a little bit of trouble distinguishing between what accommodations are, what modifications are, and then what instructional strategies are. And so that's part of why we started this work and for co-teaching was to how do we help them and support them around those areas. And then the next thing is, how do we make sure that accommodations were helping our students gain access to the general ed curriculum? So we talk about the use of accommodations and modifications, but how are we making sure that that's working for students with disabilities? And then the third question is the role of teachers. What is that role of regular ed teachers? What is the role for special education teachers? When we talk about differentiation, when we talk about providing accommodations and modifications in the classroom, and then how do we make sure that our students are benefiting from accommodations and modifications? So I'm going to leave that there and just pause for 30 seconds and let you all think about those questions. Okay. So I think those are all guiding questions in the way we frame this work when we start thinking about co-teaching. So it's been a shift from the way that we used to think about co-teaching, because we would just talk about the models, but really we're trying to make that more clear in terms of the roles and responsibilities, in terms of how do we distinguish between those concepts. So one of the first things we started talking about was just in special education, we talk about universal design for learning all the time. And the universal design for learning really means, how do we have different means for representing content? How do we have different means for engaging students in learning? And how do we have different means for them representing what their knowledge is? And so when we talk about multiple means of representation, what does that look like when we give kids access to material at different levels? And we do that a lot, but through like lower text levels for text. We use high impact, low readability text. So, or we have them be able to listen to stories online. So there are different ways for kids to be able to get the representation of the content. We use technology, but then when we think about the way we have students engage, how are we thinking about engaging kids that are struggling in the classroom lesson through partner work, through independent work, through our group structures, and through the different opportunities for learning experiences. And then the last thing is, how do we allow them to demonstrate that knowledge? Sometimes they can do an oral presentation. Sometimes they can do a PowerPoint presentation. Sometimes they may have to draw pictures. But when we think about that universal design for learning, that's really that tier 1, that general level of learning that's offered for everyone. So we can think about, how do we give everyone access to the content? So it's not always just our students with disabilities, but we're thinking about all students that are in that classroom, particularly our struggling students, So that's when we think about universal design for learning, we kind of think that's the big piece. That's that everybody gets that universal design for learning. And then we talk about differentiation, and we talk about what we do different, right? So when we think about differentiation, we have it's different because we have different students. It's different the way we deliver content or instruction. It's different the way we plan and design lessons. So when we get to this level, we're thinking about that's kind of like another layer of this instructional model when we think about all of our students. And so some students are going to need differentiation. They're going to need to have content just in a little different way, or we're going to have to think about the process that we deliver in just a little different way. And that might include, activities that are visual, that are kinesthetic, the way we group students. And then again, in process, how do we allow students to be able to have access to the curriculum and demonstrate their knowledge through that process? Can they do other kinds of presentation? And then what can we do in their environment? And those are some things that are very common that we probably already know, and particularly for experienced administrators, I'm certain you all are familiar with those things. But as we're building this in the context, we have that main layer of what we do for every single student. That next layer is what we do different for students who have some unique needs or different needs. And then we start thinking about those kids who have accommodations. Those could particularly be our 504 students or our IEP students. And so what we think about accommodations is whatever we do here in accommodation allows us to provide students opportunities for equal access or equitable access to instruction and assessment. And so that's for our students with disabilities, but you could have students that have 504 that have accommodations and modifications. And so on this slide, you'll see that we're talking about what do we change through the environment or our practices to help students overcome the challenges presented by their disability. So when we think about a student that has a disability, a learning disability in reading, what is it that we're doing to get them, to accommodate them, to get them access to that curriculum? And we're thinking about that curriculum at their grade level. So how do we get them access? So if they are at the 5th grade level and they're reading on a 1st grade level, how are we getting them access? So that's what we are talking about here. That's the tools and the procedures. And so sometimes that becomes confusing but between what our accommodations are, what our modifications, and what's the instruction. And again, we know that if special education teachers are having trouble with that, probably regular ed teachers are having trouble with that. And then we know that your role as a school leader is to coach and to model and to lead that instructional piece of that. So that's why we're really trying to take some time and focus on those levels of support throughout your schools. But so when we accommodate students, we don't change what they learn, but we change how they access learning. And that's so important because we're thinking about access to that grade level standard. So for the example I shared with you about a 5th grade student that's reading on the 1st grade level, remember that they're going to be assessed at that 5th grade level. So if we're not changing what they learn and what that expectation is at the 5th grade level, but we're changing how we have them access it. So in accommodations, we may let them listen to an audio version of the text, or we may have somebody read that, or they may have a read aloud, or they may have somebody that helps them to scribe those. We might have them for those kinds of things. So we're just making sure that it's how they get access. That could be that we print PowerPoint presentations off that we're using for our lecture and have kids give them to them. That's large print in kids that have visual disabilities. So there's all kinds of ways that we can accommodate, because what we do is we think about what's the disability, and then what can we do, what tool or procedure can we use then to accommodate that student to get them access. So that's always really important, because just because we're accommodating or we're using a graphic organizer, we're not always teaching them how to use it. And that's the real distinction between accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction. So this one, we're talking about modification. When we're talking about modifying, we're talking about students that's generally kids on alternate assessment, because we're not modifying the standard. We modify through the alternate assessment by reducing the breadth and depth and the rigor of the standard by using the alternate assessment targets. So we still have the Kentucky Academic Standards, and our students are still assessed on the Kentucky Academic Standards unless they're on alternate assessment. And so that's another thing that kind of is hard for that distinction for teachers, is to make sure they understand the difference between modifying, because we're not modifying content. The only time we're doing that is for those low incidence students that are on alternate assessment. Again, that one's a tough one for them to think about. So here's some examples. So accommodations could be an extended time. They could be a reader. There may be things that we do to prompt or cue students, or like I was talking about, give them a copy of the PowerPoint so they have a visual for their note taking. We might use manipulatives. We might have a scribe. But the idea with accommodation is, how is the student learning the material? That's what we're doing. We're making sure that they are able, the how piece of that. And when we modify, that might be that we're maybe altering a test question or removing a question that a student has. Back when I was teaching, sometimes we thought we would modify the test, and that means that we might take away two answers on a ABCD question. We might take away two answers and leave them with two. But what we didn't do during that time would be to teach them the test taking strategies, or to teach them how to reason, or to think about how to get to that answer. So if we always leave it at two, they're never really going to get to how do I problem solve to find the answer if I have 4 multiple choice questions. So that helps us also to think about it. Over time, we're still trying to get them from where they're at to as close as we can to that grade level standard. That's really our goal in special education. So it's not to just get them accommodations and modifications and stop, because there's another level. There's a whole nother level around specially designed instruction about teaching them. And again, we're teaching them for independence, to be successful and to be independent. So, modification is when we think about the changing in the content of what the student's expected to know. We don't want to change the standard, but we might modify just to be at the level of the amount of content that they have, because we might reduce that. And instead of giving them 50 math problems, maybe they only have 20 math problems, right? So there are some things in the amount of what students is expected to do. And then what are we expecting them to learn? How far are we expecting them to go with that learning? But again, remember, we're still assessed on that standard. So this is allowing them to really think about, what they're expected to learn, and how can we make sure that we modify that. And sometimes we do that through, we just chunk pieces of information. We break that down into a much smaller skill. So those are some things we're thinking about with modification. And so I'm going to spend just a minute talking about then that next layer. There's another layer that's beyond accommodation, that's and modification. So if you're thinking about kind of a cake, the bottom level of that cake is that universal design for learning. So everybody gets that. And then the next layer on top is that differentiated instruction. So that maybe is not all students. So that's that next tier of that cake. The next level then is that tier of accommodations and modifications. And remember, that could be our F504 students or our IEP students. But then the next layer is that specially designed instruction. And we choose specially designed instruction because it is it's needed for those students who have a disability, because not only do they identify with a disability, but they are in need of a specially designed instruction approach. And so I love this slide. This one comes from Ann Benninghoff, and she talks about what specially designed instruction is and what specially designed instruction is not. And so you'll see it is connected to their goal. It is that we monitor it. It is instruction. It is generalizable, and it leads them to be independent. So that's what we have to think about, that layer. How do we help kids be independent? So it's not just giving them a tool, a graphic organizer, or it's not just giving them an extended time, or it's not just giving them a number line or note-taking pages, but it's really teaching them how to use the resource. And there's a reason we think about that as we preface this going into co-teaching, because understanding those tiers or levels of the different supports that we provide students is important as we start thinking about how we design lessons. So in specially designed instruction, we define that as the way we adapt content, the methodology, and the delivery of instruction. But when we do that special instruction, so that's what students get in addition to what all those other layers. So they still get that bottom layer of UDL, they still get differentiation, they still get accommodations, modifications, and then the level above that is the instruction. And so that's what we're thinking about, because again, we're giving them access, because the federal law says that we have to give kids access to the general curriculum. So that's the work that we do here. And so we do that through the way we adapt content. Again, we talked about that a little earlier about how do we use different text lexile levels for text. We might change up how the content is delivered, right? We may break that down into some smaller pieces. We're not changing the content, but we're chunking the information. We could be prioritizing the content that's critical. And then we have to look at our standard and think about the progression of the standard and what the cognitive demand is for each grade level. So if a kid is trying to do inferencing, for example, at the 4th or 5th grade, then what skill maybe did they miss? So that's where we go back and we choose that particular skill. And then that's how we teach that. And then how can we add additional content or build background knowledge for our students because they maybe are missing some of that prerequisite. So here, we don't lower the standards for all the students with an IEP. And generally that's been an error that we've made, is that we lower that standard. And if the child's in 5th grade and we keep lowering that, we only aim for a 1st grade standard, we're not really going to make that reasonable progress over time. So that's why it's really important that we think about that. And so here's the methodology. So now we think about the method. So we do have to have some understanding about the methodology. How are we going to teach that? This is the how part of how we're going to teach students. And so are we going to give them a multisensory approach? Are we going to chunk material? Are we going to use manipulatives? Are we going to scaffold? What are those things that we're going to do in order for the student to be taught those standards? And again, this is where it comes in with special. And you'll see that note at the bottom of this page. We're talking about the special. That's our obligation or civil right, right? This is what we're talking about. When we think about students with disabilities, we're required to provide them that specially designed instruction. So we never simply stop at accommodations and modifications. We always have to move on to the way we're teaching, the how part of that, and making sure that students get what they need. Again, that's our obligation as educators, both in the general ed and the regular ed setting. And then the other thing is the delivery. How are we delivering it? And so we have explicit instruction. We have lots of practice turns and feedback. We have a lot of having all kids respond, having them recall. We use mnemonics. So when we're talking about the delivery, we train a lot in explicit instruction. And what the research tells us is the more a student struggles, the more opportunity they need for practice turns and feedback. So sometimes in the classroom setting, our students that have disabilities are generally those kids that don't want to respond, or they're not raising their hand every time to answer a question. And that's because they're not comfortable, or they don't have, they've not really accessed it. Their cognitive demand, we have kind of allowed them to not be, give them a little leeway on that. So sometimes they kind of opt out. And so with the work that we do here, we're having kids making sure that they're not opting out, but they are part of that conversation. And so thinking about practice turns and feedback is real important. And on through this session, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So those are the big things that we have to do from those layers that we're talking about with how we get all the way up to specially designed instruction. What we just talked about, how do we apply that to co-teaching? Why is that important? Why did we spend that time thinking about the distinction between those areas? And again, I think it's a lot to do with making sure we're able to help teachers understand those distinctions and those differences, and for both special education teachers and regular ed teachers. And we know in our region, we have a lot of new teachers, both in both general ed and special ed settings. So, that's something that we are leads and facilitators on those conversations. So I think that's important. So when we start thinking about co-teaching, I'm just going to pause a second and let you all read this. So the benefit of co-teaching then is that we have two teachers highly qualified in that classroom setting. And so we're double the expertise and experience and skill that we can bring to that classroom. So it's really of an added benefit. And here's one of the things that we know about our students with a disability. And this came from the Department of Education. But 66% of our students, so at least 2/3 of our students that have an IEP, spend 80% of their day in the general ed classroom. So why is it important for us to think about having that understanding about accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction? It's because the kids are in the general ed setting most of the day. And the benefit of that is they're going to get that grade level instruction. They're going to get to see a model of what is good thinking and problem solving and responses, versus if you're always with students that are the same with the same level, we're never going to hear that dynamic conversation about what our understanding at different levels. And so that's a critical piece for our students. And then we want them to be with their peers. Again, the intention is that we have them with their, as much to the best extent possible, that we have them with their same age peers. And so here's just a slide talking about inclusion. And really, inclusion is a belief or an overall consideration that we think that all students can learn. That it's important that they participate with their peers. And when we remove them from that setting, it's very intentional. So it's not, we're just not pulling them out for all the time for extra help. But when we pull it out, it's very, very intentional. And through co-teaching, that allows that inclusive practices to happen in the least restrictive environment. And so that's a critical vocabulary piece there, is that least restrictive environment. What's the least restrictive for this child to be successful, to get access to the curriculum and make progress? So this is just a general information about the why and the how for co-teaching. But the reason we do it is because we have students with disabilities in the regular ed setting. It allows us to use two highly qualified teachers. We reduce the ratio between the teacher-student, and then we give targeted support. And every kid can participate. We can have lots of turns and practice. We can give them feedback, and we can use all kinds of different group settings. And so you'll see on the right, we talk about the methods. So that's the research-based strategies. That comes from Dr. Marilyn Friend. And we used to train that these are the 6 co-teaching practices. And we've changed the way we do that. Now we start thinking about what are the most high yield practices, what is going to get us the most gain, and what are we going to have the best results. And so that's where this one is a slide that comes from the co-teaching principles, practices, and pragmatics handbook from the Kentucky Department of Education. And you'll see those 3, I've starred the ones that are most effective. And that is the station teaching, alternative teaching, and parallel teaching. In special ed, we use sometimes the one teach, one assist model. And that one is just that you got one teacher teaching and the other one's going around helping. Or you have the one teach, one observe, and the teacher's teaching and you've got to teach another teacher observing. Those are the least effective models. And they recommend them the least amount of time in the classroom. If you've got, you're observing some behavior or time on task, or how long it takes for a student to start with completing an assignment, you might use the one teach, one observe, but that would be for a brief moment, or that might be for a set amount of time that you were collecting data. And that would only be used for collecting data. So maybe your progress monitoring. So that might be 1 day a week, or 2 days a week, that you're only doing it for 10 or 15 minutes because you're looking at a set of a particular amount of time. And that's just that time this observation would occur. And so then you would go back out into one of the other models. But station teaching is one of the top, it is the top most effective approach. And then you have alternative teaching in parallel. And we'll spend just a minute talking about those, because I don't really want to take all your time thinking about just the definition of them, but what does it look like? And if you'll see, I love this slide and then this link, because station teaching, it's talking about different ways that we have stations set up in the classroom. But you think about that level of engagement, and we're talking about all those levels to the cake that we were referring to earlier. You can get those through these practices. And so that's the most important thing. So when you're thinking about whole group teaming, that's when they're team teaching. And here's an example of that. So that's a whole group when you're talking about how you may have one teacher teaching and the other one is supporting that. But there are ways they can support that by maybe you graphing, maybe showing other examples, maybe putting a model or example on the board. Back when I was teaching, I was collaborating in special ed classroom. And one of the things I would do would be to maybe make a visual or a graphic organizer that kids could see. So all of the visual learners that were in that classroom too could engage in that learning as well. And then it became a prompt. It could be a prompt or cue for kids later. And it could be something that was used in part of your specially designed instruction. So you can use that, but you don't want to use that very often. Same as the teach one observe and the one teach one assist. So those are generally when there's whole group instruction. But to really move the needle, or to put your thumb on the scale of how we have an impact, looking at that small group approach is some of those most effective ways. And station teaching is one of those. And then you have parallel teaching, and then you have alternative teaching. And so you can go back and read those. I'm not going to read all of those to you, but you can go back and think about how it's appropriate, what you want that to look like in your school, and which one of them you may want to choose something, for example, one model, and let everybody get comfortable with that and practice that before you try to add any other layers on. And so here's a station. And so you divide that station up into, so what's recommended is just 3 stations. And so some of us that are primary, we're used to maybe having literacy stations or group stations. But in this model, you have 2 stations. One station will be led by the regular ed teacher. The second station will be led by the special ed teacher. And then the third station is going to be an independent station. And sometimes we make mistakes by bringing too many stations at one time. And so that's where sometimes we falter just a little bit. But when teachers are thinking about the station teaching model, they plan for 3 stations. And so they divide that content up into different parts. And so the kids can rotate. But the other question we had last week is it okay for the teacher to rotate? And that may be absolutely appropriate for your setting. They had a small classroom, and it had lots of seats, and it was really difficult for a large group of kids to be moving around. So the teachers moved, and absolutely. The idea is that the station serves as that much lower ratio of teacher to student, and that there's something very specific. And so think about the benefit of having the regular ed teacher run that station, and then the special ed teacher run their station, and think about their level of expertise. So, maybe the special ed teacher is running a vocabulary station, and they're using a model, and maybe they're using the Freyer model to teach vocabulary, or maybe they're developing vocabulary foldables while one of the other teachers is working on a particular skill. And then at the independent station, that's going to be something that the kids can do on their own that's already been taught. But we think about, practice time over time, and we talk about distributive practice and cumulative practice. That could be done in an independent station, so kids can be reviewing skills that they already know, but they keep them in that forefront of their knowledge because we keep revisiting those, either through the unit at the end of the unit, or we're going back and practicing skills all year long. So that kind of helps get that in too. And what we also tell them is, like, if there's a couple, maybe the special ed teacher's only in there 2 days a week. Well, you could choose station teaching for those 2 days a week. So if they're in there from 9 to 9:30, then then they know exactly what to do and they know exactly what that task is. But even if it's 2 days a week, that the students get that very personalized learning, because you're going to get the regular ed teacher, 20 minutes of that station. You may have 20 minutes with the special ed teacher, and then the 20 minutes at the independent. But thinking about the frequency of that, and if you do that consistently, they get to see both teachers, different ideas, a way to teach things, different models. The teachers are going to use different visual supports. They may use different manipulatives. They may teach very specific skills or strategies. So it's a good benefit. The other thing is we want to think about is with the stations and groups, when we use station teaching, is that we don't want to have the same groups of students all the time. Sometimes we might want to just randomly group students so that they can have conversations, that they are peer matched up with their same age peers with different ability levels. Sometimes you want kids to be able to just do groups because maybe they're working on a particular, maybe they're at the same level and you want to reinforce a skill, and that's okay too. But when we're thinking about that station, we want to make sure that we mix it up. Because sometimes what happens is we get the same kids traveling around in the same groups together. They're going to miss that opportunity to hear what others have to say, their same age. Again, it's around that cognitive demand and the thinking about it. So it's just something to consider. And as you coach up teachers on that, we don't want to fall back to just having special ed kids in that same group all the time. We want to make sure that we have that varying ability. And there's all kinds of ways we can do that. And then when we talk about parallel, so the content, you're teaching the same exact content here. So you're taking the content, but you're dividing the group into half. So that may be that you go in the classroom and you just say, half of you is going with teacher 1 and half is going with teacher 2. The thing about this one is it takes a lot of coordination. I've heard some teachers love it, and I heard some teachers say they can't do it because of the distraction. And so at your school, you may want to think about your classrooms, your layout of your building. Is that possible in your school? And so if you're thinking about those things and kind of deciding what's appropriate for your school, you can maybe decide which one that you would want to have as your primary strategy, and that way they can continue to practice and you could coach them on that. And then the last one we're going to talk about for this section is the alternative teaching. And so on this slide, you can see that you have the big part of the group is still going to be engaging in learning, but you're going to pull a smaller group out. And so the thing about this one is we historically have had that small group maybe move to the back of the room, over to the side of the room with an instructional assistant that can read to them. And when everybody walks down the hallway, everybody knows where the special education kids are sitting at. And so we don't want to use the alternative teaching for that model, because that's really stigmatizing and kind of segregating those kids. But think about it through 3 approaches. So let's say you have a big group and you've taught a lesson, and at the end of the day, you did your formative assessment and you see that 5 students really didn't get it. So the next day when class starts, maybe one teacher's leading the bell ringer while the other pulls those 5 kids back to that table and they reteach that skill. So alternative teaching is good for reteaching, it's good for pre-teaching, and it's good for enrichment. So think about those gifted kids. How do we get that in that context of that classroom setting? Well, let's say the special ed teacher is leading the bell ringer or leading the activity. The regular ed teacher might pull the gifted group back and give them some personalized instruction and guidance. And then they release them back out for the class, because those kids are not the ones you're going to have to pull all the time. So you can use that enrichment, and using that as part of having another teacher in the room, that's a great way to do that. So alternative teaching, you can use it for enrichment, for pre-teaching, and for reteaching. And again, you can use that if you want to work on the vocabulary or give kids examples of something before you move into that content. That's always a great way to do that. Okay. So let's talk now about student engagement. So again, why is this relative to co-teaching? Well, again, we talked about for students that were struggling, the engagement piece is critical, but not just our IEP kids, but our students that are having difficulty. So when we think about engagement, Again, coaching up this co-teaching practice is going to include not just thinking about that lesson, but how are we going to engage students? How are we going to use that universal design model? How are we going to differentiate? So it really encompasses all of those things. And so we can have kids respond different ways. We can have kids respond verbally, and they can talk back and forth to each other. So think about that for kids who have trouble writing or responding all the time, that we allow them to just have conversation. Sometimes we have them think and write and then share, or sometimes we have kids get up and do an action, right, to model that representation. Let's say we're representing fractions, right, and we can demonstrate through that model of using students to stand up and demonstrate what a fourth or an eighth is. So there's all kinds of opportunities to have kids get up and move, sometimes to think and write, sometimes to talk. And when we consider all of those in that lesson for co-teaching, think about the benefit. And so here's an example. I always like to use this example because we're asking students, this one comes from the reading standards. And so the one in the center is the reading for information for grade 5, standard 3. And we talk about how we would plan a lesson using a co-teacher and a regular ed teacher, special education teacher, and an independent station. So I always choose this one because this one's a pretty complex standard, but I'm going to pause and let you think about what the critical skill is here, and then how we would have students do this standard and break it into stations. So I'm going to pause right there and let you read the standard. Okay. So we're asking kids to be able to talk about interactions between individuals, ideas, or concepts in different kinds of text over the course of the text. So maybe you're talking about character analysis or character development, from how a character is at the beginning of a story all the way to the end. And on this one, we're using informational. So we're going to use historical or scientific text. So if thinking about that, let's move to the next slide. What would we ask them to do? If we had what would the regular ed teacher be doing there? Are we going to talk about character analysis? Are we going to talk about story sequencing? Are we going to use story elements for the regular ed teacher to be doing in that station? And what's the special ed teacher going to be doing? Are they going to have models? Are they going to have kids look at timelines? Are they going to use a graphic organizer for stories to organize the thinking? What are we going to have that teacher do? Maybe there are some very tier 3 level vocabulary that needs to be done. Could the special ed teacher work on the vocabulary while the regular ed teacher talks about character analysis? So there are all kinds of ways that we could think about when we break that standard down. What's the regular ed teacher going to do? What's the special ed teacher going to do? And then what are we going to have the kids do independently? What do they already know that's relative to this skill, or something they want to need to practice a little bit more on, that we choose for them to do in the independent station? So let's say we know that special education teachers can't maybe be in the classroom all the time. So let's say Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, there's a special ed teacher in the 5th grade from 10 to 11:45. So, or 10 to 10:45. So let's say so that we're going to have kids rotate through those stations. So kids could have 15 minutes. If you've got 45 minutes, you can have kids rotate for 15 minutes. So the kids get the benefit of the regular ed teacher, they get the benefit of the special ed teacher, and then they get the station. So while students with IEPs are rotating through there, the special ed teacher is well aware of what their specially designed instruction is. And so they can implement that or apply that during that time. So then you are actually able to implement SDI, and you can be taking data during that same time too, right? So we try to figure out how we're going to progress monitor, or how are we doing interventions for that pre-referral process. So we know a student's struggling. How do we use that research-based intervention, deliver that, and collect data? You could use that while you're rotating kids through those stations. And so that's a way that we can collect data. So there's multiple ways to do that. So those are all kinds of ways that we can have, because sometimes teachers have trouble figuring out, how can I get all this in? Well, by using one of those models, you can do that. So that is a wonderful way to think about that. Also, if you use that alternative teaching strategy, if you could pull back for progress monitoring. So when special ed teachers are trying to figure that out, as administrators, you can offer some ideas for some support for them along the way. So it's not impossible. And again, teachers are having a hard time trying to figure out how to get that progress monitoring in if they're in a pre-referral process. You can use this same model. So hopefully it's just a tool to help you kind of think through that, but also how to help them understand how to break that down, and teachers break those skills down and then assign them. And if I know as a special ed teacher, each time I come in that classroom and I go to my teacher station and I already have my things and materials ready, I'm not going to miss any instruction time. And talk about shifting that bell to bell work to a very explicit, you get every single minute. We don't waste any minutes. So we have to decide, when is it that, when are we coming in on the lesson? Are we coming in on the large group instruction and then shifting to one of the other models that goes to small group, for example, station teaching or alternative teaching or parallel? I mean, any one of those could be options, so that we very quickly know. And once you start planning, and once teachers work together, they pretty quickly can shift the actual thinking about the content, because they've already got the stations set up. They've got the structures set in place. They've got a system for progress monitoring. They have a system for checking whole group progress, right? So we have all kinds of formative and summative assessment ways that we can check that. And that informs our instruction the next day. So those are all ways that they can do that and do it efficiently and quickly.
Can you hear me, Dion?
I can.
Okay. I was just wanting to say that just as an example, you had shown the fifth grade here. And when I was in the classroom, I actually was in a fifth grade classroom, and we did the station teaching. That was one of my favorite models of co-teaching, because the way that we utilized it is, for my station, when it was the day that we were going to introduce the story and go over talking about the story and reading it, we would start with my kids, or I would start with my kids, and I would pre-teach that vocabulary that was going to be in the story. And then we would also take the time to do like a gallery walk and kind of help create that background knowledge for that story before they moved on to the regular teacher, so that she can start into the content of the other piece of that standard. And we found success with that, because that it helped with them getting confidence and lowering that anxiety. And when we started doing that, we got better participation from our students, and you could just tell that they got more out of it, and then they were more eager to learn as well. So we really loved it doing it that way.
That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that, Chastity. I think that's a great example, because those are things that we can do. And when we think about specially designed instruction, in the law, it says that the initial specially designed instruction needs to be delivered by the special education teacher. But after that, then we can implement that in the classroom. And a few slides back, we talked about generalization. And so what we're really trying to do is teach some skills and strategies that can be generalized across content areas. So if we're teaching kids through specially designed instruction, we should be able to use that across all content areas. If we're teaching them how to use an organizer, or if we're teaching them a very specific skill, then they should be able to use that skill across math, reading, science, social studies. So the idea is that we can get that specially designed instruction in there, but then we're also getting them that access, and we're enabling them to be more independent. But I love that one, Chastity. Thank you very much for sharing how you use that in your own practice. Here's some links to resources, but I added the IRIS links because those have really it'll kind of lead you through what's the difference accommodation, what's the difference for modification, what do those look like, and how's that different from specially designed instruction. And then I shared a link for co-teaching that had those organizers on it that told you about what those look like in practice. And then I added a co-teaching walkthrough. So as school administrators, you are going to be looking for things in those classrooms when you visit those. What should that look like? Well, helping you to just have that background about what co-teaching is and all of those components of that system help you can kind of know, are you seeing what you should be expect to be seeing? And that can be because you're responsible for all across every classroom. So, that gives you kind of a little quick guide. What's it look like? Because it's going to look a little different in math maybe than it looks in science or social studies. So just added that link there for your reference and your use if you can use it. And then this one is one more quote. So I'm going to pause and let you read the quote. And so I think that is the piece. Co-teaching, when we first started in co-teaching, we used some of those models that were like the one teach, one observe, or one teach, one assist, but they're very intricate systems. And if we think about co-teaching as a system, once we get those practices in place, it's much more effective than those lower level activities like just helping students as prompted, right? Or just coming in and out. So part of your system and your overall school system can include this co-teaching practices and can really make a difference. It can shift the academic performance of students, but it can shift the culture. It can feel what you're thinking about in terms of acceptance and belonging and the inclusive benefits of that, and that all students feel valued and feel important, and they have access to the curriculum. And thinking about that, I think about those kids at the end of the day, they're always assessed on that grade level standard. So how do we move that and increase our level of expectations for students with disabilities? Because sometimes they surprise us with what they can accomplish when we hold them to those high standards. And that's what we're really trying to shift. Let's hold kids to a higher level. I mean, we obviously know that if they have a disability, we're going to modify and accommodate, and we're going to have an understanding about that. But how is it that we can push those kids? Because if you look at the data, there's 70% or better of our IEP kids do not have an intellectual disability. So they have the ability to learn. And inclusive practices allows us to do that. And co-teaching is a mechanism for that. This will conclude our session, and we appreciate you being with us today. And hopefully you've taken something back that you can use at your school as you facilitate and lead those PLCs across both the regular ed and general ed setting.